Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Andy Costello, and I'm Head of Customer Solutions here at Kineo. Our Kineo Conversations webinar series features a different subject matter expert each month to join the Kineo team and explore a key topic of interest. This format will be an open chat rather than a presentation style, so if you're expecting a lot of slides, I hope you won't be disappointed. Today, I'm joined by David Wilson, who many of you will know, I'm sure, is the founder and CEO of Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, a major commentator on the HR, talent and learning industries for over 20 years. David is a strategic advisor to many major corporate and supplier organizations in the UK and in Europe. He leads Fosway's research and corporate advisory agenda and is the author of over 150 research papers and articles, as well as being a leading speaker at major conferences and events around the world. In fact, I've had the pleasure of seeing David speak at a number of events across my career, and I can honestly say that I've never gone away without some golden insight about what we're all striving to do in learning technologies and L&D more broadly. So thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Well, you've always gone away until now. Is that what you're going to say?
Yeah. Well, let's see. No pressure at all, of course. But before we do get into that, just as a reminder for those watching, please do add your questions into the Q&A tool, as we've reserved the last 15 minutes at the end of the session for questions. We'd love you to join the conversation, so let us know if any questions you have, and my colleague Alex will be keeping an eye on these, and she'll come in at the end for Q&A. We've also got the chat function open. So hopefully that will be working. So do please post your any questions you've got there, and we'll be keeping an eye on that too. Just make sure you select panelists and attendees if you'd like everyone to see your comment. Great. So without further ado, David, let's get on with the conversation, shall we?
Perfect.
All right, now I want to start with a bit of a bugbear of mine. We've got three categories to get through if we can, but the first one is perhaps one of the juicy ones that I know is a bugbear for many clients. We've got people all over from different organizations and different levels of learning technology familiarity listening in on this webinar. And of course, one of the things that comes up time and time again is the level of jargon, terminology, acronyms, things that we here every year, changing or slightly changing in the events we attend. And one of them, of course, that is in our title is that of the LXP label. Now, in 2020, Fosway rejected the LXP label, moving to a definition of learning systems, suites, and specialists instead. What was the reasoning behind this?
So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, learning technology is not unique in doing this, but as an industry, we love the jargons and the terminology, whether it's LMSs and LCMSs and LRSs and LXPs and God knows what else. So we've been tracking obviously the market for a very long time. We made a conscious change about 5 years ago when we started looking at a shift from what we would call a traditional LMS to what was something that was a bit more focused on next gen learning in one form or another, micro learning, video, social, whatever. And that was about the time that the LXP started to be adopted. So Josh Bersin started talking about learning experience platform as a concept, really as a layer on top of the LMS. And I think one of the things that we really struggle to do from our research, and we go very deep in tracking this topic within corporates and also in terms of the different vendors offers, is really just we kind of got the idea that people wanted to have a different story and a different narrative around what they were trying to do, but we didn't quite understand that classification and how that really worked in organizations. In big companies, maybe it makes sense where you can turning the super tanker that's their corporate LMS to make it deliver a great experience for learners, when it was never implemented to do that. It was implemented typically to be an efficient admin vehicle, to manage compliance, to optimize, classroom training, administration, or whatever it was. Suddenly, we moved the goalpost and said, oh, we want this to be a great user experience for the learner and enable them to be a lot more proactive. And so, there were a lot of background factors that came around that. I guess, though, the real killer for us was that because we do so many briefings and talk to so many corporates around what they're trying to do, I think the simple reason was it was really, really confusing. Almost every vendor that didn't want to be seen as an LMS was positioning themselves as an LXP. So they were coming on saying, oh, we're an LXP, and we go, yeah, okay, so tell us what you're really doing. And then obviously from a corporate point of view, when they were looking at the solutions, they seemed to be really confused about what in reality an LXP was really going to offer them. What was it trying to do? So we kind of, the other thing that I think we thought behind the scenes, this was something we made a prediction of actually very early on when we started talking about next gen learning environments, was that for the majority, particularly if they're selling into the mid-enterprise market where customers really can't afford to have multiple solutions, they needed to basically, if they wanted to be a one-stop shop, they had to also do the other stuff as well. So what we started to see was the LXPs and NGLEs backfilling LMS functionality and vice versa. So, it seemed to be much more sensible to actually say, well, you're either trying to be a modern learning suite or you're trying to be a specialist. Okay, and if you're a specialist, what's your specialism? What is it you're trying to do a disrupt? And that seemed to be a lot more straightforward in terms of the conversation and a lot more transparent. And interestingly, we made that announcement that we thought the LMS LXP terms of differentiator really didn't make sense. So that's now what, 15, 16 months ago, we had 80,000 people engaged in that conversation around it, which for a kind of niche learning technology topic was really quite a big deal. And we really felt, so it really kind of hit a nerve. Not, and some people were quite defensive around it, but obviously even a lot of the vendors, so most of the poster child companies for LXP, because of the timing, we were talking to them and they go, they get this as well, right? They like the fact that they get RFPs for an LXP. They don't like the fact the customer hasn't got a clue what they're looking for. So that's basically the reasoning behind it.
And often it felt to me in some of the events that the providers weren't entirely in agreement of what they were offering. So you'd be there at an event and there'd be 4 or 5 different people standing up talking about their own LXP, and not one of them would align with the other one.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'd find companies that were doing social and video learning, and companies that were doing micro learning or adaptive, or somebody that was basically just creating something that was more on the mobile or something. And every vendor's pretty much got an AI roadmap, and every vendor pretty much wants to have a Netflix user experience on the front end of it, right? So I mean, that's the other thing, is a lot of the sense of what potentially could have been differentiating turned out not to be differentiating at all, because everybody was so busy trying to tell you they were an LXP. And what we effectively said is, stop telling us that. Tell us what if you're trying to be disruptive, tell us what you're trying to disrupt, right? So actually give us the authentic story about what it is you do, and now we can start to tell the difference. And that led us last year we did a massive research project to actually strip apart the learning experience story and the learning experience platform story, to deconstruct that into those component specialisms, and then to deep dive into those.
So it's what it is they're trying to do rather than what it is that how they're trying to deliver it almost. Yeah. I mean, the rise of the LXP and that coincided with the time, or rather the phrase came and led to it and helped market it, was this big provocative headline of the LMS is dead, long live the LXP, etc. Now I get why people are kind of using headlines like this, and we're not suggesting the LXP is dead. You're talking about obviously just a different way of constructing the narrative there. But why do you think, would it be fair to say then that the idea of the platform, that LMS, the way you defined it, how it was originally intended, a destination for people, not much more, that is now gone? It's more about the experience of the user and how they are engaging with the learning, rather than giving them a place to end up on and find the stuff they've got to find, albeit as difficult as it can be in places.
Yeah, I mean the LMS is dead statement was always rubbish. I mean, and there's a very good reason for that. No organization can be less compliant now than it used to be, right? So you don't get more admin resources to manage learning that you had before, and things like this. So all the drivers for LMS are still there, right? They haven't gone away. And arguably, you could say with COVID, a lot of those have been even further accentuated. The difference was before, that was all we were focused on, right? Was largely around the administration and management of learning, and obviously particularly around things like compliance and instructor-led, and then launch and track of e-learning and all those kinds of things. Those are still there, right? They haven't gone away. But what we've done is we've moved the goalposts. We've added a whole bunch of other things on there, not least because what we've gone is from that maybe push model of learning where these are the things you have to do, etc., and the catalog and concepts like that, towards a much more learner-driven approach. So we want learners to be more self-driving in terms of what they're doing. We want them to be able to more easily find stuff. So search suddenly became the main paradigm for accessing learning rather than a catalog, for example. I mean, this is not new. This has been going on in the background for the last 10 years. But over time, it's accentuated. And I think the other thing that we've got is we've all got much more conscious around that front end experience around things. So the rise of the user interface and user experience as the sort of number one decision factor on platforms. And as I said, that maybe then further expanding into things like, oh, can we, that we want to be the Netflix of learning. So the idea that Andy goes on and we know what kind of Andy needs to know and we know what he tends to look at, and I can just kind of provide you with a shortcut to that list of things that you might be most likely to do, the classic Netflix 99% fit type of thing. So that idea of using AI and machine learning to make intelligent recommendations, put that together, one-click launching, and all of the things that go alongside it, creating a better user experience around it. Those things obviously typically were not part of the parameter set of an old school LMS. And so we've moved the goalposts, right? Well, the other stuff hasn't gone away, and that's one of the reasons why we've seen a lot of the LXP, NGLE type solutions backfill LMS functionality in order to be able to be a one-stop shop, right? Because you still have to do that stuff sometimes as well. But we also want more from it, and in particular, we want the learner to be much more engaged with it and find it a lot easier to get stuff that's relevant to them easier.
So with that point in mind, and sticking with the customer side of things, the people that want to buy this stuff, you mentioned earlier on that LXP providers love getting an RFP. What they don't like is when a customer doesn't really know what one is. Is there therefore a gap in the personnel, the resources that a customer needs now that they perhaps they didn't need before? So where you had an LMS manager before, somebody that would book in the cohorts and roll out the kind of training and and automate it as much as they possibly could. Now, while perhaps some of the AI interfaces aren't quite where they promised to be, there's still a human kind of requirement to curate and to design programs of learning and to be a bit more LX savvy, if you like, that wasn't there before. Do you think that's fair? Perhaps a new role in L&D that we haven't yet considered or recruited for?
Yeah, so I think L&D constantly evolves in that journey, and obviously you also saw the rise of the instructional designer, for example, in terms of raising the game around the instructional outcomes and the experiences that were being created, and I think that we are seeing the same. We're seeing the same things around. I think the moving away from maybe an instructional design towards more of an experience design, right? And thinking about what that means, we should kind of talk about that a bit more. But the other side, of course, is there's the experience of the platform, the engagement, the things around it, and then of the learning itself, right? So that's the other side of it. The other thing, of course, is COVID has massively accelerated all of this, right? Because overnight, as a game changer, everything had to be done digitally, right? So literally, you've magnified the pressures to do things, even though you may have also constrained the ability and the resources to actually get them done. But yes, I think the transition from focusing around instructional learning goals and learning outcomes and instructional design to thinking about this as more of the experience of doing the learning and how did that really drive outcomes is something that is certainly another layer on top of that. But the old stuff hasn't still gone away. We don't want it to have a bad instructional design just because we're going to have a great front end experience, right? And I think it's ultimately it comes down to what's your measure of success on this. And I think this is one of the challenges, obviously, that learning L&D deals with all the time anyway, probably badly, which is what outcomes do I get from doing this? And I think measuring outcomes based on a view of what the experience was is really as probably as false as measuring what the happy sheet was on a
Sure.
on a classroom course, right? So it ultimately what really matters is, does it make a difference?
Yeah, yeah. I want to get onto measurement in a bit, actually, and just how important it is to make sure that what we're doing works. For goodness sake, yeah. But just sticking again with the customer, and we started this segment talking about, let's get away from jargon and terminology, and I'm finding it really difficult to do so. But if I'm new in the market, let's say I'm a buyer, I'm after a new platform. The pandemic has hastened the move to everything digital, but it's not something my organisation has been really culturally ready for, or perhaps enthusiastic about, but I need to change and I need to get with it quickly. What's the first thing I should do?
Um, I mean, the first thing I think you need to do is be clear about what outcomes you're trying to create. Start with the end in mind, I think, from that point of view.
Mm.
And then I think understand how you're going to deconstruct and achieve that, right? So most of the time, this is a multi-headed hydra you're dealing with. In some cases, it's not even a learning problem, right? So I think that's also being mindful around there, mindful around that. I think also it depends on who you're working with and what you're doing. Are you trying to build and design these things or develop them internally? Or are you working with partners to do it? How do you put together, and I think that, but it also needs to, I think, align to what is it you are trying to achieve, and then ultimately what will make that feasible, right? What will actually make that possible, and how do I deconstruct it into it?
Mm.
I think we sometimes find, particularly in the digital learning technology market, people get very fixated on part of the answer. It's all about the platform, or it's all about the content, or whatever. And I would argue it's all about the outcome, right? And the rest is just, to some degree, it's about how those other things come together in a contextually relevant way for that organization and for those learners in order to create the outcome. So I wrote a paper, I don't know, one of those 150 things or whatever it was, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, saying, when everybody's saying content is king, I was thinking, well, content's not king, right? Context is king, and the output, right, is the thing that matters. And I think that but we do get fixated in the parts, and we like to polish the bits and play with new toys as well, which obviously then leads us back to where you started from,
That's the
which is
problem, yeah.
new acronyms and new pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. The takeaway there is, outcomes are everything, but also it might not be a learning problem that we're trying to fix, which is always refreshing to hear, or possibly far more complicated. We could dive into that a bit later. I want to move on now just to the next section that we had. If we're covering sort of acronyms and jargon, one of the other things you talked about and we've seen a lot of lately is almost a merging of L&D, HR, talent. A lot of big movers in the market are suddenly bringing out all sorts of platforms, for want of a better phrase, or technologies or suites that are bringing together not just learning, but also an employee experience. We're seeing with Microsoft Viva, etc. Totara's talent experience, well-being being a huge theme under which there seems to be all your learning needs and employee engagement needs that are sort of hanging off in some of these technologies. Now we've seen skills, reskilling and upskilling all gain more prominence and interest since the pandemic. And technology seem to be bridging this gap. Do you think that is a trend we're going to see for the long term now? How's it going to play out?
Well, so absolutely. I mean, there's a number of pieces to that jigsaw as well. So, I mean, skills, before we went into the pandemic, skills was probably already at the top level for CEO concerns, and in particular, the inability of companies to recruit the right skills they needed to support or grow their business. Interestingly, obviously, the pandemic has had big impacts from an employment point of view. In the UK and in Europe, we've been a little bit protected for that because of furlough schemes and things like this. Maybe the US, it's been a bit more brutal in terms of the impact that that's had. But I mean, at the end of the day, the skills that you couldn't recruit before are the ones you can absolutely guarantee are in even greater demand now, right? So digital being a good example, agile working, the transformative stuff, the higher value, knowledge impact stuff, AI and data scientists and all the things, right, that now almost every business needs, because everything has had to pivot to be digitally led. Those were the things you couldn't hire for love nor money before, right? So the reality is that skills issue is absolutely there. It's super acute, even though it's hidden in some places because of the economic consequences of the pandemic. But as things start to open up and regrow in places, then it'll be very tangible very quickly. There's a challenge about recruiting those skills. We find a lot of pressure around talent acquisition in a lot of companies. So therefore, if you either build, buy, or borrow, right? So if you can't buy them in, you're either borrowing them somebody else, contract labor and other bits and pieces. Obviously, contract labor has been massively impacted by pandemic. They're probably the worst impacted part of the economy in many ways. So then you're down to build, right? So strangely enough, a central agenda for pretty much everybody, and this is true if you're looking at HR and HCM, it's true if you're looking at talent, if you're looking at, and then obviously in learning, skills has always been a big agenda. Skilling, reskilling, upskilling, reboarding people, but doing that in a way that's aligned to a transitioned organizational model. These are all absolutely huge. And the interesting thing about the skills agenda is everybody wants to own it and nobody wants to share, right? So all parts of the technology stack there, whether that's the HCM platform or your recruitment platform or a talent marketplace or your LMS learning suite, they're all trying to own it. They're all trying to use their own AI and machine learning to build their own ontology, but nobody really wants to share. So there's not much skills interoperability within the ecosystem, and it's a really kind of a big thing, but it's a huge topic. Because of that shift also to now, digital learning, digital HR is the only game in town at the moment. So that's put a lot of pressure on vendors to transition their offering to better support that. Most of the learning vendors have seen probably a 300%, 300% increase in utilization of their platforms during pandemic because suddenly everything was being done through that mechanism. So yeah, it's a huge factor. But because that skills issue being really at the center of, and that being aligned to whatever the new business needs to be post-pandemic, that kind of stuff is going to be, it's going to be critical, and you will see HR vendors make land grabs. We're already seeing acquisitions happening there. Some of the biggest vendors have invested a lot. Some of the biggest enterprise vendors, learning is almost one of the number one growth area for them, and then that aligns obviously straight back to that skills agenda.
So switching that again, just quickly to the customer's perspective, if I'm working for an organization where traditionally L&D, HR, talent have all been very siloed, the first thing I could do is go, guys, look, there's big stuff happening here. We only need to see this trend is going to continue. Let's start pooling our resources and working together on this, because there's still a lot of disparate probably efforts. And as you say, people are not wanting to share, but all wanting to own their own agendas.
I admire your optimism. I mean, it's. The reality is absolutely, and I think the challenge is that. So to a large degree, this is happening already to some degree. I still think L&D is too siloed, tends to be in what it is, and often as it gets kind of pushed together with some of the talent agenda, etc. I think the challenge often for L&D is it's often the junior partner in those conversations, right? So, and when you then start looking at it from a systems point of view, it's certainly a junior partner when it comes to talking about HCM and the HR system. So the reality is I think L&D needs to up its game here to be able to, and to be part of those bigger conversations, yes. But there's also, I think, it understands part of this problem better. I've been working, we've had Fosway for 25 years. We've been tracking that, skills and learning and competencies and all that kind of agenda throughout that entire period. This is at least probably the third or fourth time we've been around that skills loop. And what we understand is it actually doesn't work that well, right? So it's not easy to build a skills taxonomy that is meaningful within a business context. That's why a lot of organizations historically that started to do that ended up with a very abstracted and simplified view of what key skills they had. It's certainly very hard to use that to drive work outcomes, right? And work allocation and staffing decisions and so on and things like that. So If I look at some of the big HR vendors, they may have a skills on taxonomy structure and so on, but maybe they don't understand things like proficiency. Right, you either have the skill or you don't, which is meaningless from a work point of view. Right, you have to know whether somebody's actually any good at it. Right, and it's actually the context and combination of skills that actually helps determine who's going to be effective. The other thing is skills. The other key dynamic in all this is team. In organizations, it's teams that are the unit of production and the unit of outcome, right? Not necessarily individuals. And I think then thinking about how you think about this in a teaming sense, in a multi-dimensional way, is also important.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point there you mentioned about L&D having to up its game to sit at the bigger table as well and to have those conversations. I've seen examples where L&D have joined up with marketing departments. It's all about comms at the end of the day, rolling out messages and embedding behavioral change, etc. So that's increased power to the budget ratio and allows L&D to have a bigger footprint sometimes in some of those decisions. So that may actually muddy the waters further, I suppose, but it's a way of adding more strings to the bow, I suppose, of learning.
And we're seeing that coming into the technology platforms as well, because you're seeing some of that marketing automation type thinking and digital marketing type thinking coming into learning as well, right? So how things like campaigning, learning activities across an organization,
right?
This is kind of stuff that you guys have been doing for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. With that in mind, actually, you're talking about sort of campaign learning and behavioral change. One of the things that the talent experience and employee experience that I mentioned earlier on is kind of alluding to much more is the person, the human behind it all. So is it all about people now? Is that what's changed because of perhaps pushed by COVID, that we're missing the human-centered touch, if you like, and that, as I've seen loads lately, wellbeing rightly taking a center stage in many learning priorities within organizations, but more than that, actually being almost the umbrella term under which your learning, your development sits.
Yeah, and I think in a number of different ways as well. So one of the things that we talked about in our 9-grid report for digital learning was it's really the time to put the human back into it effectively and think about. So, that's not just a design ethos, right? I think it also comes down to actually understanding that it's not about, a knowledge acquisition or passing a test. It's about the ability to apply something in the workplace and the ability for somebody to really either, internalize and engage with that topic and to be motivated by it or whatever. And I think when we kind of managed that in the past in other ways. So to some degree, the role of the course was other than in some circumstances, because I think in some cases this was quite explicit, but for a lot of training courses that wasn't really even a byproduct of them, right? It was all about, you walked in the room, you were sheep dipped through this process, and you came out with a certain set of knowledge that theoretically you could apply, and nobody worried about too much about whether you really did or not. And I think thinking about the individual and also the context of interpretation, if I can put it like that, and the context of application around whatever the topics we are doing, I think becomes much more central to the efficacy of whatever it is. And I think it was interesting when in old school, when you went from like classroom to e-learning, and everybody's talking about, you had this massive ROI on return on investment on e-learning because it saved you all this money on delivery. And the question, I just turn around and say, well, and does anybody apply any of it, right? Does it make any difference? Because if you can't prove that, I've got an infinite ROI. Just don't do it, right? Just stop doing it completely, because whatever it is, if you can't prove it's making any difference, then and I think is it making the difference. So a lot of this aligns to the same thing around the outcomes and the ability, what really drives outcomes for you. The other thing that you talked a lot, which I think you talked about, which I think is really interesting, Andy, as well, is that we're in a very different mode, particularly if people are working from home and they're on back-to-back Zoom calls, or they're on these things when they're going into the content. So there is a role within the learning activity around getting people motivated and engaged and positive around their role, their organization, their contribution. and that ties back into that sort of sense of value and well-being as well. And I think the more that we're dealing with a mostly remote workforce, the more that the inspirational aspects of this thing becomes important as well. It can't just be functionally good. It also has to inspire people and get them engaged, even around really, mandatory topics and compliance stuff and things like that. Because it's soul destroying if it's not, right. So I think that if for things to be effective, they have to push some of those buttons as well.
Precisely, yeah. I mean, I've been in the industry a long time. Started off as a learning designer, which, as you say, then again the jargon changed that role several times to mean various different things. And there's always been bad online learning experiences out there, bad online learning design out there, and I guess there always will be. But I remember it when it was, the height of interactivity was click next to continue, and everybody was blown away by it. But of course, you've got now a situation where throughout the pandemic, as you said earlier on, David, everyone quickly had to convert to digital. We had to suddenly hastily plug a lot of gaps and get our learning rolled out. Now, a lot of organizations were already there brilliantly. There are some that have been way ahead of the curve, arguably still with a lot of the same old content, but it was ticking the box. It was doing what was needed to do. And now, of course, things are different. And I think you mentioned in your report what some organizations are now going to need to do is just look at those gaps they've plugged rather hastily, perhaps, where they've brought something off the shelf, a rapid, internal development that they've created, and look at rationalising those decisions, those purchasing decisions, because they've got to measurably work. And if they can't demonstrate that they're working, then it's a waste of money, right? It's going to be very costly. How do you think they go about fixing that? How do you think they have those honest rationalizing conversations and begin to look at does it need to be a priority, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
So I think as in terms of the priority of thing, I think it aligns to where that organization is, right, and what's driving them in this current period. There's a massive difference if you're Amazon that's hired 100,000 people in the last X year or whatever it is, or however many hundreds of thousands they've hired, versus a hospitality business has been completely shut, and maybe as of next week can open its doors as long as they've got a garden that they can put people in or whatever. And so I think there is something around alignment to it. Absolutely, though, I think a lot of what was done, and we shouldn't decry what's been achieved by L&D in transitioning towards that digital. I mean, it's been the speed of change has been enormous, and the other thing is obviously that only a few percent of companies think it's going to go back anyway. So a lot of that transition's got to stick. Now, I think the discussions about things like, we're going to shut all the offices and everybody's going to permanently work from home, or what's the hybridness in there, right? So we know there's going to be impact on workforce, and whatever strategy we need to do needs to work remotely as well. So we need to have a digitally enabled and a digitally led strategy. But I think it's a lot of what's been done is what I would call lowest common denominator. It's literally what's the minimum thing we can do to keep the lights on, right? The wheels on the road, right? And that's okay for a while, right? And I think that's been hugely successful. It isn't necessarily a good way to run a high-performing business, especially if it's going to be mostly virtual, right? And mostly remote. And I think this is where organizations really need to start reconsidering what their strategies are and starting to attack some of the bigger topics that probably they haven't really focused on. One advantage they've got, historically, the biggest challenge I think for most learning teams is what do they stop in order to put resources in to do some of the new stuff. And one of the things that COVID has done is stopped an awful lot of things. So a lot of the business as usual that dominated the training budget and the instructor time and designer time historically has kind of had, if it wasn't really critical to keep the lights on, it probably hasn't happened, and not many people are asking for it to be restarted. So I think the thing is then, how do you use maybe some of that discretionary resource, assuming it hasn't all been furloughed or whatever, to actually attack some of these bigger topics. And that's what we're starting to see as organizations look at, particularly things like the more developmental activities around leaders and performance, and also bigger transition of the business, digital transformation as well, and think about those more programmatically and then in a way that is a bit more multidimensional, as opposed to, yeah, let's just run a Zoom course on that and a Zoom session.
That's a really interesting point you raised there, that there could be a huge sea change if people aren't asking for the lights to be put back on, as you put it. There's an opportunity here, isn't there, for organizations to do a really quite brutal or ruthless look at what their provision, their learning and training provision has been over, pre-pandemic. Where are the noises coming from? Where's the clamour to get this back? How can they translate it to a more of a virtual or a remote audience, or do they need to at all? And that's a big question, I suppose. There's a big opportunity there to, as you say, to realign resources, if not, but also to rationalise what's been the point almost up until then.
It's a very common conversation we would have had pre-COVID, which is when you're talking to an organisation, a learning team that is trying to transform in a more fundamental way. The challenge is all their resources are tied up into doing all these things that they can't really, they were kind of non-negotiable. Well, suddenly they're rather negotiable, because you've stopped doing them for a year, and a lot of those things, nobody's really clamoring to have them back, right? So I think it does create, there is more discretionary effort in there. The risk is for learning, again, for L&D though, that it has to prove that where the value is, right? Because the other risk is, if I've stopped doing half of this stuff, I only need half of the resources and half the people. The fact that actually what we desperately needed was to have a whole bunch of things put into stuff that was really going to accelerate the transformation and create more outcomes for the organization, but we weren't really able to resource it properly. I think we still need to make that case, right? And to do it, but that's ultimately where I expect that shift to happen. The other thing is a lot of the barrier that was there. So, and it varies from organization to organizations. I think some, again, when you track it over 20 plus years or whatever, you realize some are more enlightened than others, and have got the fact that this isn't just for compliance and just for certain basic things, but you have to, that's someone who's making the case to do the important stuff this way, right? And then starting to think about this as almost a digitally led programmatic experience with, and what are the elements that we need to put together to make that really effective and to drive the outcomes we need. And that is definitely more complicated than commissioning just an e-learning course, right? Or a video or whatever it's going to be.
Which comes back to the point about the human-centered design, or the human experience design approach, where we've got organizations where there has been a clamour and a perceived need or otherwise to urgently digitize or translate something to virtual classroom after virtual classroom. We've seen digital fatigue, haven't we? That's another a phrase that you coin in your reports, that not just through your learning and your digital learning, but we're all experiencing it through, and we're look at us doing another one through digital classroom webinars, etc. So we've got to think about that whatever we do now in the context of this delivery has got to be a lot smarter, a lot more human centered.
And there's still a lot that hasn't made that transition, right? So from the corporates that we're dealing with, many of them have just taken block training courses and running those as block virtual training courses, using the same slideware content and stuff over Zoom or Teams or whatever. And that is not a very effective strategy, right? So we need to kind of rethink that as well.
Yeah, agreed. Just sort of coming towards the end of the third segment here before we go into Q&A, there have been some big tech developments that you've referred to throughout this chat and also in your reports. AI, we hear loads about. Obviously AR, VR, or XR as it's now collectively known, have yet to really take off in learning. I'm not sure. I'm sure some people would hugely disagree with me, but in the broader sort of generic sense, how much of this do you think has been due to the pandemic? Do you think it's there yet? AI, this kind of machine learning and the algorithm-led adaptive learning that we've heard so much about for well, 4 or 5 years now, probably, perhaps longer. And yet we're still we have still competing chatbots, at the highest end in some organizations. What's the landscape really like there? What's the true picture? And do you think it's been impacted by the pandemic, or it's just still not quite where it needs to be?
Yeah, I mean, I started live working in AI 35 years ago, thinking it was going to transform the world in 10 years, and maybe it will, but I will be about 25 years out, roughly, in terms of timing. I think we see on the supply side, certainly looking at the vendors, particularly the technology platforms, pretty much everybody's got a AI machine learning story as part of their roadmap, or they've been investing in it, or made an acquisition, depending on where they are in the spectrum of size and ability to do that. It's interesting because I think a lot of that is what we've seen, and we've been tracking that very actively actually for about 5-6 years, including corporate research. I think a lot of corporates were nervous and still are nervous around the implications and how they applied it in some of the early technologies. People would actually turn some of this off rather than turn it on as well. So I think corporate readiness is behind where vendor readiness is, if you like to push it forward. But evidencing it in the product, if you like, and in the solution is still a challenge, right? So I think that's where we're seeing a lot of it's quite slow to bring things through in terms of things that really profoundly impact the end outcomes for people and all the capabilities in the platforms. And some of it is actually a bit retrospectively focused, right? It's addressing problems that have been historic challenges. But it's definitely going to grow, and it will definitely be part of what we're doing. And having smarter interfaces that enable us to just optimize what people get to look at first, so that it's easier for them to action, help them find things that are more relevant to their context faster, is obviously relevant. I mean, the other one is we fixate a lot around the user experience on things, but what does the user experience mean if we're going to end up accessing things through chatbots and natural language programming and things like this, right? Suddenly the UX of the front end system doesn't really matter, because it's always going to be accessed through something else. And that's a key thing as well, is how do I surface all this stuff within the systems of work, within Teams and Slack and things like this, but also within whatever it is you do, whatever your day job is, right? If you're an insurance broker or a customer service engineer or whatever you are, right? I mean, how does learning kind of surface itself into that? And I think AI has a role in that. COVID has, I think, accelerated the desire to automate more a lot of those things, and to do that in a smarter way. But it's also limited the resources of some companies, particularly on the customer side, to adopt some things as well, right? So they've slowed down, in some ways, innovation, just focused on very basic things because they just didn't have the resources to do otherwise. Yeah, but it will emerge more, I think.
Big thing you mentioned there, David, was evidence-based impact. Measuring the learning, and presumably if it's going to help measurement and the evaluation of learning, so we can demonstrate that it's working however it's supposed to work, that's going to encourage more investment. And yet organizations are, often talking the talk. They need to know that their investment is having an effect, but few seem enthusiastic to kind of invest not just the budget in measurement, but also the resource. It takes time to measure. Presumably things like AI and the emerging technologies can speed that along. Why is it still a difficult conversation sometimes to get organizations to go, okay, right, we can help you measure the efficacy and efficiency of your learning? It doesn't seem to be a priority beyond too often the box ticking, which is, to coin a very old phrase. How do we get into?
It's a perennial challenge, I think, for L&D anyway. Sometimes we go through waves where it becomes a lot more acute and visible that they're trying to do this. I think partly it's also this separation from learning from work, as if learning isn't, so that we'll focus on learning objectives rather than business outcomes and things like this. It's not a straightforward thing to do. The other thing is, the more you're siloed, the more you only know about your bits, right? So obviously we've known from a people analytics point of view, the ability to look at activities and processes from an HR and learning side of things, and put that together with business data to be able to show business outcomes and to look for correlation, which may be different slightly to causality, but actually look at relationships. I think at the moment, more companies are still focused around things like engagement scores and some kind of view of experience rather than real outcomes. But I think it's an inevitable thing that we need to take more ownership over trying to do it, and maybe also join up with looking at what really drives performance rather than just what drives, good learning outcome, a good learning outcome, right? So
yeah. No, so perhaps that's a conversation. L&D, of course, are very keen that their learning is landing in and being embraced and engaged with, and people love it. It looks great, and I'm going through everything in the right sort of timely manner. But perhaps the conversation to be had is that business impact, and are they as interested as the business needs to be?
And what are the other factors that surround that, right? So there's an expression I came up with quite a long time ago. I talked about the conspiracy of convenience, which Charles Jennings also kind of picked up on, and which is that often actually it's not just the learning function that's reluctant to talk about business outcomes. Sometimes the business is as well. It's a lot easier for a business leader to sit there and say, yeah, I've got a problem. I ran a workshop. Everybody was happy, rather than it wasn't even really a learning issue, and did it drive an outcome for it? But because it's a kind of proxy, it's a sticking plaster to say I've done something about it.
Yeah.
And we've seen it very explicitly in big projects. Often the last thing that the business leader wants is somebody questioning whether their big business investment, which the learning was the last little bit of the equation, actually was effective and made sense, right? Because the last thing they want to do is somebody go, well, actually, we're not delivering any business value for that, are we? Because the measure is not whether the learning was successful, but whether the project was successful, right? And so I think there are other factors involved in it, and at the end of the day, it's complicated. But at the end of the day, if we want to get, it's really, really important that learning leaders are able to engage strategically in their organization and be seen as their organization seen as somebody that adds value. And if you can't prove that in a meaningful way, and so the other thing that COVID is doing is stripping out a lot of that business as usual stuff that really wasn't adding value. Nobody's really clamoring to have it back. So if I don't have to do it, and if, or it's not obviously adding value, maybe it won't come back. And I think that's ultimately a challenge also for L&D as well. Is if it doesn't raise the game and to engage in that conversation, then potentially it could be impacted negatively by that agenda as well.
100%. Yeah, great. Thank you. All complicated themes, as you say, but all important, vital, and solvable. And it's about asking the right questions and getting the support that you needed, which of course we can help with, but have those conversations internally as well with your colleagues. And it's time to move on to questions now, David. I think so. Alex, I don't know if you're free to join us.
Hello.
Hello. How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Yes.
So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so we've had a few questions come in. So thanks everyone. If you do want to add more questions, just type them into the Q&A and I'll keep an eye on those as we go. So I'll kick off from the top. So does instructional design moving towards experience design potentially mean the end of authored content and SCORM delivery? I don't know who wants to pick that one up.
I think there's multiple parts to that as well, right? So go on, Andy, you respond.
No, you first, please. Rephrase the first part of the question, Alex, please. Could you just repeat the first bit?
Does instructional design moving towards experience design potentially mean the end of authored content and SCORM delivery?
Right.
No. If we're talking about ecosystems and multiple layered facets of learning to build into a program of experience and activity, and then any element can play a part in that, and that requires its own type of instructional design, for want of a better phrase, or learning design, or creative writing, or video production. So no, I think we're going to see smaller nuggets, I hate that phrase, but smaller bursts of learning, however it might be delivered, and therefore perhaps the end of the bigger kind of standard SCORM course that may now be built up of more sort of sophisticated elements, and that's more of a program design, an experience design, if you like. But certainly, no, not see the end of instructional design. Far from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the instructional design is an important sub-element, right, within all of this. We want it to be effective and efficient and so on, and ultimately we need it to collectively add up. I think the thing about experience is a bit more multidimensional in terms of what you're trying to do, and it tends to be more maybe around the overall combination of things and how they come together in order to drive that outcome, and to drive a positive experience for the person that's consuming it, right? It'd be relevant and tied to them. The second part of that question, which is like talking about content authoring and SCORM. So obviously, I think one of the things we've seen is a fragmentation of what learning content meant, right? So from that classroom PowerPoint type stuff to instructor-led models and things into e-learning, etc. And then suddenly there was this plethora of different learning channels and things you could do. And COVID is, the number one learning channel in COVID was video. And so I think designing the elements well, designing them to fit together, designing them to understand how they come together for the learner within the context that they're operating, right? It's a big difference between doing this in a more structured, theoretical way versus on the job versus, in a collaborative way with other colleagues and so on. So I think pulling all of those things together, they all require that. The last bit of that question was around SCORM, right? So I think the other thing is, that ultimately comes down to how do you package the elements and package the pieces? How do you launch and track it? SCORM's notoriously a point of failure in most learning technology, digital learning architectures. It's a thing that often fails to track properly and fails to get SCORM compliant content running in SCORM compliant LMSs. Turns out to be more of an interpretation than a guaranteed cast iron reality. And I think obviously there's other models here around tracking things as we start looking at, XAPI and LRSs and other things. I mean, the interesting thing is we almost monitor everything now, don't we? I mean, somebody said to me that, well, we don't want to use e-learning standards because it's all going to run like a web page. Well, web page is about as tracked as you can possibly get, right? We've got cookies and things recording everything, but what we're not necessarily recording is the traditional learning completion steps and the mastery scores and the things that maybe those are. So yeah, I think all of those things are in play, but they need to be a bit more multidimensional.
The other thing we're not tracking, of course, is the application of that learning longer term, the behavioural impact it's had, and SCORM obviously won't necessarily record that. And just to your point, absolutely, SCORM, it's controversial and a bit dated now, but it all depends on the delivery platform that you have, many of which are still old LMSs with SCORM as their metric of choice, I suppose.
Well, remember, we're still largely running on SCORM 2004.
Right. Yeah.
In lots of things, but still. Anyway.
Cool. Thanks, Faye. This is an interesting one, I think. So this has come in anonymously. What's the best course of action for an organisation that has fallen victim to the LMS is dead messaging pushed by LXP providers and who is now regretting that decision?
See, I knew that there would be somebody that has. I love that, fallen victim. Wow. Over to you, David. I mean, this is just the consequence of good marketing. I don't know. Somebody somewhere has had success with that, but it's provocative, as we've pointed out, and potentially it's leading.
I think the reality is it's being clear ultimately around what is important to the organisation. And as I said, I mean, we don't see, I think when we've done this research multiple times over the last 10 years in our digital learning realities research, and you're normally looking at less than 1% saying they want to turn it off, the LMS. If you ask them how many are satisfied with the LMS, it might be, you might have 30, 40, even 50% people going, it isn't really fit for what our purpose is, but actually they still need some of the capabilities underneath it. I think the reality is about going back to basics, understanding what it is the organization really needs. Depending on the choices you've made, some of those LXP players as would be, so many of those are now actually learning suites. They've backfilled LMS functionality. but ultimately they may not do that well enough for your purpose in the organization you're in. And it may be that you just need to move towards something that actually is better at doing both things, right? But as I said, the idea that you just don't need any of that stuff, I think is just false, really.
Yeah, what he said.
Great, perfect. Thank you both. Next one, with increased remote working, how can we make sure we build in collaboration that feels genuine and isn't just another digital platform or tool that employees have to find and use?
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on this, I think, David. If I'll go first, this goes back to the human piece, doesn't it? We had a thing called learner-centered design for a long time, instructional design, and what we're talking about now is, how different is it, putting the human at the heart of it now, especially given the current situation with remote working. For me, it's about finding the human element in all the learning, and that's how good learning, if we're talking about content delivery, for argument's sake, that's what good learning is, isn't it? It's what's in it for me, what's the consequence of me doing this and succeeding, what's the consequences of me not doing this and not engaging with it, how does it apply to my job, my life, my well-being. If we've really understood those human elements, and we can do that by, if we're replicating a classroom session, speaking to the classroom, the person who was delivering that originally, and the people that you're delivering the content to, what matters to them. So it's just about broadening those conversations out and having more meaningful ones, which I think we failed to do in L&D. We've delivered and pushed content that we've tried to make engaging through shininess and whizziness and all those things, and not thought about ultimately the consequence of the learning not hitting the mark, and therefore the learner not being able to take it and do something with it later on in their lives.
Yeah, I think the thing I would add to that is almost any learning that really mattered, that, to what people did for the job, inherently is probably collaborative, right? So
Right.
If you think about any important development programs that companies run, that are really central to them, or they want to run them in a collaborative way, and including within a classroom. The whole point of the classroom dynamic, if it's a thing, is you get people to work with other people, you get people to review other people's answers, you create a conversation amongst the group. So I would probably argue that beyond basic knowledge acquisition type stuff, collaboration is a fundamental dynamic of the learning process. And it's the bit that e-learning, the old school e-learning narrative, rather forgot, right? It got sidetracked by it's all about great content and so on. And I think therefore the answer in some ways is make the collaboration fundamental to the learning process and to the success of the learning process, and to use it in a way that is very aligned to that. So use it as a fundamental part of the learning model. And interestingly, when I first started Fosway 25 years ago, one of the things we got really interested in, because I came at this not from a CBT online type model of things. I came at this looking at how collaboration and internet technology was going to change training and education, and then we got pulled into talent and other things. And when you came at that, we were really interested in looking at stuff that business schools and stuff were doing. And inherently, that was all inherently collaborative at the beginning. And I think so, making it core foundational. I think if you're content led, you've already missed the point, right? And think about what that, from a learning process point of view. Think about how you use it. Think about leadership training courses where the first thing somebody does is set up an action learning sets and get people to work on in groups of 3 or whatever it is, and analyze problems and come back a recommendation. They present them back to the rest of the group. How do you bake that into the core of the learning process when it's digital, right? That's what will make collaboration more than another platform. Make the learning process driven by collaboration and supported by content, not the other way around.
Absolutely. You're quite right. We haven't touched on kind of the social aspect, and something I could talk about for for hours. But you're right, you know, the big power of learning is the collaborative point, and arguably that's the point of the office. You know, people come in to collaborate in the office environment, and so why should it be any different? I think we're out of time now for questions, so there are others I'm sure we've got which we'll pick up offline, share with everybody here. So thank you for that, Alex, and thank you, David, for your time today and for the great conversation. Some really good points. As I say, we'll share with everybody the link to the recording. We'll also try and unpick the sort of a time code approach where we'll cover each of the topics we've covered for ease of reference. Everyone will also receive an advanced copy of our new white paper, which is the learning maturity model. There should be a few slides coming up now. I think we've included some links here also to the latest Fosway research. And if you haven't already, then I'd certainly recommend downloading the Fosway 9 grid for learning systems and digital learning. And there are all sorts of other articles that are invaluable for us in our industry. Finally, just to give you a heads up on something that we've got coming soon at Kineo, and that's our digital learning health check. We're launching later this spring. It's designed to help you reflect on all the things we talked about today, and in particular your digital learning readiness, really from your culture, the appetite of your organization, to the content, the technology, and across the skills that you may already have in-house, but you didn't know you had. If you want to get in touch with us, one of our experts with our brand new digital health check tool could help you figure out where you currently stand, where you'd really like to be, and what it might take you to get there. So keep an eye out for that, or as I say, get in touch through the details on your screen to register interest. Thank you all. David, thank you very much. Always a pleasure, and fascinating insights as ever. And have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thanks, Andy.
Cheers.
Thanks, both.